1793, the United States was just 17 years old and still lacked a fixed seat of government. The founders had spent a decade fighting over the location. New York pushed hard. Philadelphia made its case. Virginia demanded a spot along the Potomac, far enough south to prevent Northern influence from dominating the fledgling administration. Their solution came the way so many early compromises did, around a dinner table in a private room. Alexander Hamilton secured federal assumption of state debts. Thomas Jefferson walked away with the capital on the Potomac. That handshake deal happened in New York City during the summer of 1790. That they gained was a 10-mile square of marshland and woods straddling Virginia and Maryland. No roads, no quarries, no residents, no labor force. A French engineer, Pierre-Charles L'Enfant, laid out the design. The street grid, sliced by broad diagonal avenues radiating from two grand anchors. A presidential mansion and a legislative building perched on a modest hill above the river. The L'Enfant never erected a single structure. He refused to hand over his drawings to the commissioners. He demolished a wealthy landowner's house without asking because it sat in the path of one of his avenues. George Washington dismissed him. The commissioners inherited L'Enfant's blueprint and a crisis. They had to erect a national capital for a government scheduled to arrive by 1800. Just 7 years away. A capital, an executive mansion, federal offices, bridges, roads, all of it atop mosquito-infested bog and scraggly second-growth woods. And they had next to no funding. Congress had given them virtually nothing. The scheme was to sell city lots to raise building money. But no one wanted to buy property in a swamp. George Washington himself rode down from Mount Vernon to pitch speculative buyers. Most said no, so the commissioners did what nearly every American construction project of that era did when conditions were punishing and wages couldn't attract willing men. They leased enslaved people. I've been digging through the Commissioner of Public Buildings records. The surviving ledgers sit in the National Archives, written in tight 18th century copperplate. Columns of names and figures, the wages disbursed, supplies received, work completed, and woven through every page are entries for enslaved laborers. First names only, with their owner's name beside them. The commissioners weren't paying the workers. They were paying the workers' owners. If you care about the people who actually raised the building where American democracy was supposed to reside, the men who dressed the stone, hauled the brick, mixed the mortar, whose names appear on no plaque inside those walls, please subscribe to Forgotten Timeline right now. This channel lives or dies on subscribers. Hit the button and come back. Because what I found in those ledger pages is something the official tours never mention, and it's been sitting in those archives for more than 2 centuries. Here's what you need to understand first. By 1793, slavery wasn't some fringe part of the American economy. It was the economy. Virginia's tobacco fields, South Carolina's rice plantations, Georgia's indigo operations, all of it ran on enslaved labor. And the new capital had been planted right in the middle of that universe. The 10-mile square sat across Virginia and Maryland, 2 slave states. The men who owned the land being developed were slaveholders. The commissioners overseeing the project were Virginia men who knew exactly how the region's labor market worked. When they needed workers, they knew where to turn. They placed ads in local newspapers. I've seen the text of one reproduced in a 19th century history of the city's founding. It called for Negro carpenters, bricklayers, sawyers, and common laborers to be hired out by their owners to the public buildings commissioners at a monthly rate. A skilled enslaved carpenter brought about $5 a month paid to the owner. Common laborers earned less. The man doing the work saw nothing. The enslaved workers came from plantations around Alexandria, Georgetown, and the surrounding countryside. Some arrived from farther away, leased in groups. 5 men here, a dozen there. Seasonal contracts renewed if the owner agreed. The work pressed on. At the height of the building seasons between 1795 and 1800, estimates drawn from the commissioner's records suggest the enslaved workforce on the capital site alone ran from roughly 400 to 600 men per season. That number shifts depending on how historians interpret the incomplete records. But what's clear is that enslaved labor wasn't incidental to the project. It was foundational. They did the heaviest work. First, clearing the land. Jenkins Hill, the low rise where William Thornton's winning Capitol design would sit, was covered in old timber and brush. The trees had to fall. The stumps had to be yanked. The ground leveled. 80 men with axes, saws, and ox-drawn chains cleared it across 1793 and into 1794. Then came the grading. Then the foundation trenches, cut 4 feet deep through clay and decomposed sandstone. Straight-walled trenches measured against surveyors' stakes. You can't lay a stone foundation on uneven ground. The men who dug those trenches did it by hand, with iron spades in the July heat of a Potomac summer. Then the brickwork. The Capitol consumed millions of bricks over its 7-year construction. Those bricks were made on-site in kilns built on the east side of the grounds. The process was simple and merciless. You dug the clay. You puddled it with water until it reached the right consistency. Not too wet, not too stiff. You pressed it into wooden molds, 1 brick at a time. You struck the top smooth with a wet rag. You turned the green brick out to dry in the sun for 2 or 3 days. Then you stacked it in the kiln, hundreds of bricks at a time, and fired it for 48 to 72 hours, feeding the flames with wood. The temperature had to stay high enough to vitrify the clay, but not so high that the bricks cracked. A skilled burner could read the flame's color through the kiln vents. The enslaved men working those kilns pulled 12-hour shifts. The summer of 1797 in Washington was one of the hottest on record. A contractor's assistant, who wrote a short account for a Philadelphia newspaper, noted that the brick burners worked through the night by firelight and that several men had to be pulled mid-shift because of the heat. He didn't record their names. He recorded the output. 12 bricks in 4 days from one kiln, and then the stone. The Capitol was built of sandstone quarried at Aquia Creek, about 40 miles south on the Potomac in Virginia. Aquia Creek sandstone is a pale buff color, soft enough to cut with hand tools, and had been used for Virginia manor houses for generations. The commissioners hired quarry operators to supply dressed stone to specification. Those quarry operators, in turn, they used enslaved workers to do the cutting. The method for cutting dressed building stone in 1795 was the same as it had been for 1,000 years. You identified the stone's grain, the direction it would split cleanest. You drilled a line of holes with a hand drill, a steel bit driven by a wooden mallet, each hole 2 or 3 inches deep, spaced 6 inches apart along the split line. You drove iron feathers and wedges into the holes and tightened them in sequence until the stone cracked along the line. Then you dressed the faces, chisel and mallet, stroke by stroke, until the surface was flat and square to specification. A dressed face had to be true to within 1/8 of an inch. A block that was out of square would show in the wall. The mortar joints would be uneven. The courses would drift. An experienced stonecutter could feel a bad face with his fingertips before measuring it. An overseer's log from the Aquia Creek quarry in the summer of 1797. A fragment that survived in a Maryland county deed book because it was entered as evidence in a later property dispute, records the work in the flat language of a man accounting for production. Stone cut this week, 47 feet face measure. Stone lost to cracking, 6 feet. Men present, 14. Men absent, sick 2. 14 men cutting 47 feet of dressed sandstone in a week in July, heat at a Virginia quarry, swinging iron chisels and wooden mallets. The 2 men absent sick don't have names in the fragment. They are recorded as number 1 and number 2. The quarry's numbering system for its enslaved workers. I don't know what was wrong with them. Quarry work produced stone dust that coated your lungs and left you coughing by month's end. The creek nearby was both the drinking water source and the waste dump. The waterborne illness moved through those camps in summer. Cuts from flying stone chips went septic in the heat. The contractor's doctor, if there was one, isn't mentioned in the fragment. Number 1 and number 2, absent 2 days. Back in the count of 14 the following week, the stone they cut that summer and the summers before and after. It's in the walls of the United States Capitol right now. So before I tell you about the 2 men I was able to find by name in the commissioner's ledgers, and what the records reveal about where they went after construction ended, please subscribe. The algorithm buries these videos unless enough people signal they want to see them. 1 click, then come back. Because what happened to the men I found in those ledgers is the part I keep returning to. Let me tell you about Len. He appears in the commissioner's payroll records, listed as the property of James Hoban. The Hoban was the Irish-born architect who designed the president's house and supervised construction on both buildings. He had arrived in America as an indentured carpenter, made his name in Charleston, and came to Washington with money, connections, and several enslaved workers he had brought north from South Carolina. Len was among them. He's listed as a carpenter. He appears across multiple building seasons, 1795, 1796, 1797, and into 1798. His entries are tied to finished carpentry on the Capitol's interior, floor framing, window, and door casing, the detailed work that follows the rough structure. Finished carpentry is skilled work. It requires reading a drawing, transferring measurements accurately, cutting joints that fit without gaps, understanding how wood moves with moisture and temperature. A man who couldn't do those things wouldn't be assigned to it. Hoban received $5 a month on Len's behalf. The entries are in the same handwriting, the same ink, the same matter-of-fact accounting style as the entries for sand, lime, and iron nails. I searched for Len beyond those payroll records. He doesn't appear in any manumission deed for the district. He doesn't appear in any census record under Hoban's household that I could find. He doesn't appear in Hoban's will, probated in 1831. So what that most likely means is that Hoban sold him sometime after the Capitol work ended. The sale records for enslaved people in Alexandria and Georgetown during that period are incomplete. He could be anywhere in them. He built the floors and window casings of the United States Capitol. He is not named anywhere inside it. The second man I want you to know about is listed in the records as Daniel. He belongs to a Georgetown landowner and merchant named Notley Young. Young was one of the original principal proprietors of the capital city. He owned a large chunk of the land the government purchased for the new district and was paid accordingly. He was also paid by the commissioners for the use of Daniel across at least 3 working seasons. So what's striking about Daniel is that his labor classification changes in the records. In 1796, he's listed as a common laborer. In 1797 and 1798, his entries are associated with masonry work. He learned something on that site. Masonry, laying brick and stone in level courses, mixing mortar to the right consistency, reading a plumb line, building corners that stay square, is a skilled trade. You don't arrive at it by accident. Someone showed Daniel what they were doing, or Daniel watched carefully enough to teach himself. And by his 3rd season, he was doing it well enough to be reclassified in the payroll. When Capitol construction wound down, Daniel went back to Notley Young's property. Young died in 1802. His estate inventory, which I found in a transcript of Maryland probate records, the pages dry and brown at the edges, lists enslaved people by first name and estimated value. There's a Daniel on that list, valued at $300. $300 was a high valuation for 1802. It reflected a skilled man. Whether it's the same Daniel from the Capitol payroll, I can't say with certainty. The name was common, but the valuation fits, the geography fits, the timeline fits. $300. A man who had helped build the capital of the United States, assessed at $300 in a dead merchant's estate and sold to settle debts, soared. I keep asking because what comes next? The burning who rebuilt it, and what the Congress that met in that building did and didn't do to account for the labor that built it, is the part I want you to stay for. The British burned the Capitol on the night of August 24, 1814. A force under Admiral George Cockburn entered Washington after the American militia broke and ran at the Battle of Bladensburg. If Cockburn walked into the Senate chamber and held a mock vote on whether to burn the building. The vote passed. His men piled up furniture, books, and anything flammable, poured gunpowder on it, and set it alight. The sandstone walls cracked in the heat. The wooden roof structure burned completely. The Library of Congress, rooly 3,000 volumes, went up. The chambers, committee rooms, corridors, everything combustible was destroyed. A thunderstorm that night helped save the outer shell. The rain came down hard enough to douse the fire before the stone superstructure collapsed. So when the commissioners surveyed the damage the next morning, the walls were still standing. Scorched, cracked in places, black with soot, but standing. The same Aquia Creek sandstone that the unnamed quarrymen had cut from the Virginia hillside in 1797 had held they rebuilt. Reconstruction began almost immediately. Irish craftsmen were brought down from Philadelphia. Local stone cutters returned to repair the damaged walls. And enslaved laborers were leased again because the legal structure hadn't changed and wouldn't for another 50 years. The records for the reconstruction are less complete. Several commissioners' files had themselves been burned or water damaged in the attack. But what survives shows the same pattern. Hired out enslaved carpenters and bricklayers, listed by first name, wages paid to owners. By 1819, the building was functional again. A new low dome had been built over the central rotunda. The chambers were restored. Congress resumed its business. Here's what I keep returning to when I read those records from beginning to end. The men who built this building did skilled, precise, demanding work. The bricklayers laid courses that survived a fire set by a professional army. The stone cutters dressed blocks to within 1/8 of an inch, and the walls those blocks went into are still standing. The carpenters framed floors and fitted casings that served for decades before being replaced. Not because they failed, but because the building was expanded. This wasn't low-skill labor, performed under duress, and nothing more. These were craftsmen who knew their trades and practiced them well under conditions that would have killed many of the men who later sat in the chambers above their foundations. They were paid nothing for any of it. The country that assembled in that building went on to become the wealthiest nation in human history. The commerce it enabled, the laws it shaped, the institutions it built, all administered from a structure whose foundations were laid by men who were themselves legal property. That's not rhetoric. That's what the ledger pages show. In 2000, as part of the Capitol Visitor Center project, the architect of the Capitol's office commissioned a formal research project into the enslaved labor used in the building's construction. Historians worked through the same commissioner's records. A scholar named Jesse Holland published a book on the subject in 2007. The findings weren't disputed. The evidence was there in the archives all along. The plaque was installed in the Capitol Visitor Center. It's in a corridor. It's small. Most visitors don't stop in front of it. The building has had more work done to it than almost any other structure in America. The dome you see today was cast in iron in the 1850s and 1860s. The east and west fronts were extended in the 1950s and ISIS 60s. The building you walk through is significantly larger than what John Adams moved into in 1800. But the lower courses of the original walls are still there. Inside the foundation corridors, you can see the old Aquia Creek sandstone. the pale buff-colored stone that came up the Potomac on barges from the quarry below Fredericksburg. It's been painted over more than once, patched where the 1814 fire cracked it. But it's there. The men who cut it are not commemorated anywhere in the building that rests on their work. There's no plaque for Len, the Finnish carpenter who earned $5 a month into James Hoban's pocket for 4 building seasons. No marker for Daniel, the laborer who taught himself enough masonry to rise in the payroll classification and was valued at $300 when his owner's estate was settled. No monument for number 1 and number 2 at the Aquia Creek quarry. Absent sick in the log for 2 days in July 1797, back in the count of 14 the week after. No names on any wall for any of the 400 to 600 enslaved men who worked on this building in its first 7 years. In the architect of the Capitol's conservation collection, there's a mason's hammer recovered during renovation work on the Capitol's original foundation corridor. An iron head, a rotted wooden handle, found wedged behind one of the original sandstone blocks during a 1990s repair project. The conservator who found it estimated its age at 150 to 230 years based on the ironwork style. It was put behind that stone by a man whose name is not recorded. The stone is still holding. If you've stayed this far, please subscribe. Tell the algorithm there are people who want to hear about the men and women the official version of the story leaves out. I'll keep looking for them, as long as you let the algorithm know you're here. I'm glad you stayed with me. The United States Capitol began in 1793. Constructed with the labor of between 400 and 600 enslaved African-American workers, alongside Irish craftsmen, free black laborers, and local hired hands. Completed in 1800, burned in 1814, rebuilt, expanded, still in use. The men who built it are not on the tour.